Hello and welcome to Books and Beer. It's great to see you. My name is Luke and I'm joined today live all the way from LA, California. Andrew Warren, how are you doing, mate?
Hey, thank you for having me.
Here he is. Andrew has been excused on having a beer today because it's just 9 o'clock in the morning. And I think if you start your Thursday, if you start your Thursday at 9 a.m. with a beer, it's not going to be a particularly productive day, is it?
No, that's a bad recipe.
Absolutely. How do you take your coffee, by the way, then, whilst I'll talk about the beer I'm drinking?
It's a little strange, but I take my coffee. It's Trader Joe's vanilla Arabica coffee mixed with protein powder. So
that is a bit weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I like it.
Because I used to just do coffee and cream. That's kind of my standard. But I found, I was trying to up my protein intake and work out more, and I would just keep forgetting to do it. So I figure, well, the first thing I have every day is coffee. If I put it in the coffee, I can't forget. So that's kind of.
It's a really good idea, and not one I've ever thought of, because a lot of them can taste really weird, can't they? They say it tastes of strawberries, and you're like, there's no strawberries ever tasted like that, or whatever.
None of them are real like flavor, but mixed with the coffee, it kind of tastes like almost like a cappuccino, sort of. I think. So.
I'm gonna try.
Maybe I've just convinced myself that.
No,
so I drink it, but, yeah.
It wasn't what I was expecting to learn from you today or to take away from this conversation, but that's the beauty of chats like this.
Give it a shot. You never know.
Yeah. I'm drinking a Backyard Brewhouse Blonde, which is a beautiful British beer, one of my favourites. So
what's your favorite kind of beer? Are you like a lager or a pilsner man, or
an ale drinker? Ale. So this is it'll be warmer and less fizzy than a lager. Is the way I describe it. Yeah, proper British beer. I talk about it a lot. Do you know they do some good beers in America though as well, mind you? But sure. A lot of places like the Asian lagers and some of the European beers are nice too. But you can't beat, in my opinion, a proper Great British one. I'm a patriot when it comes to that.
One of my favorite beers. I haven't had it. I only had it once or twice. It's actually a Scottish beer. It's St. Andrew's Ale, they called it. And I think they brew it. I don't know if they brew it on that famous golf course or just near that St. Andrew's golf course, but it was really good.
Mm-mm. Were you in Scotland when you had it, or did they?
No. Somehow I got it. They shipped it. I got it in the U.S. and someone bought it for me as a joke because of St. Andrews. It was in the name.
Of course, yeah. Didn't even connect.
But I was like, this is great. Like they gave me like a 6-pack of it, and I loved it. And I looked for it a few times, couldn't find it. So it must be like a specialty beer that you import or something.
Yeah. That's great. I'll have to look out for that one. I know there are some lovely Scottish beers, and we've sort of jumped there into the topic of travel, which is something I know we're both very passionate about, which is something I wanted to talk about, because one thing I loved about your books, and I read the first Thomas Caine one, Tokyo Black, and they all have colours as well in yours, don't they? All the titles.
Almost. There's a couple that don't, but I try to work it in if I can.
Yeah. No, I like it.
It doesn't work.
It's a great theme. So what was it about Tokyo and about the place? Because it's not just set in Tokyo, is it? It starts in Thailand or somewhere Southeast Asia?
It starts in Thailand. I wanted. That's actually kind of interesting now that I think about it. A lot of these things, I think we as authors do things and we don't really consciously look at why. Yeah. But that question actually just made me realize something right now. So the book is mostly set in Tokyo, and I had traveled to Japan maybe somewhere 5 to 8 years before I started writing that book. And it was sort of the first like big international trip I ever took. And it really made an impression on me. I absolutely loved Japan. I had a blast. I just wandered around. I was, because of the time difference, I would wake up at maybe like 4 or 5 a.m., and then just walk around the empty streets by myself, and then come back at 8 a.m., take a nap, and then go out when the city finally woke up. And a lot of the things I saw and the experiences I had, like restaurants or places I went to and people that I saw, I worked into the book as little background details.
Nice.
So that trip made a big impression on me. And then years later, when I decided I was going to write a book, I really wanted to go back and visit Japan, but I just couldn't. And so the book was a way for me to take a kind of mental vacation and project myself back there. And I think that's why I started the character in Thailand, because the character also has been to Japan in the past and has a history there. And for him, he's sort of coming back to Japan. And I think I was subconsciously echoing my own, experience there in that character, but I never really even thought about that until you just asked me.
No, I love it. And I do exactly the same thing. I have only written books on my own that are places I've been to and places that I've sort of had that almost like a calling to, almost like that place has shouted at me and said, write this, write me,
Right.
And I really like what you said there about sort of walking around in the early hours, and finding those things and putting them into your stories, because mine definitely do that. And I think readers generally appreciate that. Have you had people point out things and pick out things and say, I recognize that?
I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever pointed out something specific, but I've had lots of people say that either they've been to Japan and they were like, this totally captured how it felt for me. I've had a lot of people say that. Or if people haven't been to Japan, a lot of people in the reviews, they say, I feel like I took a trip to Japan, after I read this book, which means a lot to me, because that really was something I was trying to capture. Like, that was really important to me. So when I would read that in a review, I was like, it really made it all worth it,
It really does. It absolutely does make all that effort worth it. Where are the following books in the series set then? Because I haven't read through the rest of the series yet, unfortunately.
Well, there's a prequel book called Devil's Due, and that's all set in Thailand shortly before, the story. And then further, the next book is Red Phoenix. That's set in China, mostly in China, a little bit in America and Eastern Europe as well. And then the third book, I wanted to kind of stretch a little and set it somewhere I had not been. So it's all set in East Africa, like Sudan and South Sudan.
Oh, brilliant.
So that was a lot of research, and then the fourth book, which I have finished but I haven't released yet, is mostly set in Vietnam, which I have visited Vietnam. So.
Oh, fantastic! So when's the fourth one due then, and what are we to expect from that?
I haven't decided yet. I'm sort of debating whether I'm going to publish that myself or maybe go with a small press. There's a few like offers circling, but I haven't really made any decisions yet. So holding off until, when something like that, you have to kind of look at all the angles and all the numbers. And it's like, well, if I do that, like, then they have the rights. So how do I write the next one? And, it's all kind of legal stuff. So we'll see, but not too much longer. Hopefully within 6 months, it should be out.
When you sort of say, I'm going to write a book in East Africa or in Vietnam or whatever, have you got the story before you choose the place, or do they sort of flower together? How do you get that link between the place and the plot?
It really depends on the book. I would say for the one in East Africa, I really didn't have the story. I just was fascinated by Africa. I was just interested. I thought like that would be, I'd done at that point, Thailand, Japan and China. I was like, I think it would be interesting to move the series somewhere very different from that, and I was interested in Africa. And then when I started talking to people, my fans are really communicative and open, and a lot of them have traveled. So I would talk to my readers online and through email and ask people like, hey, have you been to Africa? Like, I'm thinking of setting a book there. And I would get recommendations of places, and the whole sort of history and conflict between Sudan and South Sudan and the humanitarian crisis there, just as I did my research, really stood out to me. And then from there, the story kind of just coalesced and came together. But there's also like one of the shorter books, there's a series of short books featuring Caine as well. And one of those is set in Siberia, which is also a place that I haven't gone. And for that one, the story came first. I wanted to do a very kind of tight, lean, most dangerous game type story. So basically the story is Caine's pissed off this Russian mobster, and now the mobsters have captured him. They've like dropped him in Siberia, and there's a team of commandos like hunting him like a hunt, like for revenge for this guy. And so I just was like, well, what's the worst place, someone could be hunting you? And I figured Siberia, like you're freezing, you've got no like survival gear, no weapons. Like, how is he going to survive this? And so that the story idea led to the location.
It definitely for me makes thrillers more interesting when they're set in exciting places. And I think there's a great history of this through sort of thriller writers, isn't there? If you look at Ludlum and Fleming and these sorts of things, they're all about exciting, fascinating sort of places. But do you think you'll ever set one that is on home turf? Would you? Actually,
the next Caine book that I do after this one that I'm waiting to publish is going to be set in the U.S. Like it's going to be the first one that's all in the U.S. But I think, you can still find exciting locations. It's not going to be all set in suburbia,
Oh, massively. Well, for example, I live in the UK and you live in the US. Now, the idea for me, where you live would sound very exotic and interesting. So for me to set a thriller in LA, I'd be like, yeah, brilliant. And for you to set it in a historical city like Nottingham, you might be thinking, yeah, that's all right. But you might think that's an exciting prospect,
Right.
And I mean, I keep thinking this about London because it's a city that I visit often. It's only about 100 miles from where I live, or 120 or 30 miles, something like that. But because I visit it often, I don't have the it doesn't seem exotic enough for me to want to write a story there. But I feel like for a lot of American readers, it would be quite interesting because
it would be great.
Yeah, exactly.
And you would have the flexibility to research everywhere you want.
I could go there and really I could do fun stuff like film some videos for the launch thing just there on my phone, because I go there quite frequently, as I say. So it may be something I'll have to think about, but you just never know. You've got to sort of follow the inspiration, I think, sometimes, don't you, as well?
I think so. And I think the most important thing is that you're excited about what you're writing about. So whether that's the story side or the location side or the characters, whatever it is that kind of grabs you, like you can't fake that, so if London doesn't get you excited and you can't think of something you want to do there, obviously you can't force it, but I'm sure I'm sure you could write 1,000 thrillers in London, and people would love it.
I mean, there are, loads that are set there, and that's just one of those things, isn't it? Let's jump over and say hello to a couple of people in the comments. If you're watching, and want to ask a question of myself or of Andrew, just put that in a comment. If you want to say hello, do so. If you don't want to, that's fine too. And if you're watching this afterwards, of course,
no pressure.
Yeah, if you're watching this afterwards, of course, we won't be able to answer your questions, but you can still say hi. Alison says, hi, Luke and Andrew. Hello, Alison, how are you doing? And she says, good choice, which I assume is to do with the beer, because Alison is a real ale fan too. We always talk about this on the show. Alison, have you read any of Andrew's books? Because Alison's a very, very big thriller reader too. So let us know if you have. If not, you can get to his website and you can get on his mailing list and download the first one for free, can't you? So there you go.
That's right. There you go.
That's it. So tell me about your protagonist, Thomas Caine. Where did he come from? What other people have sort of inspired him?
Well, you mentioned Fleming, and I'm a huge fan of Fleming. I've read all the original James Bond books. I mean, I was a big James Bond fan growing up of the movies, and then I started reading the books, and I've read all the continuation novels. It's probably the only series I can think of that I have read everything available, and viewed everything available. Like I have, and I own it all. It's all on my bookshelf. So I didn't want to copy James Bond, but I did want to kind of do what Fleming did in a more modern way for America. I think like Fleming, to my mind, created the prototypical British hero for that time period, like that post World War II kind of recovery in England sort of character that embodied all of that. He embodied what people wished they could do and what he wished England's place was in the world and all of that. And so I tried to kind of get in that thought process and be like, well, what is an American version of that for today? And, at the end of the day, I don't know that the answers I came up with really matter so much. That's just sort of the process that I went through to create Caine. And a big part of it for me was I also wanted to keep an air of mystery. I read a lot of thrillers, and I always come upon the section I called the resume, where they're like, well, he served in this war and he was a member of the Green Berets and the Navy SEALs, and he was the first in his class. And I don't know, to me, those things and this is just me, then the kinds of things I like, and it's just all my personal opinion. But when I read those things, I either have one of two reactions. I either find it highly implausible that one person could do all that, or I sometimes have the opposite reaction. I'm like, oh, well, all you have to do to be a hero like this is do these things, like it kind of demystifies it for me. Like, and so I wanted to have Caine just basically kind of be a cipher almost, so I don't actually go into very much of his past in the books. And it's almost like it's kind of become a running gag whenever someone asks him about like his military record, someone will start to answer and then someone else will stop them, from giving any details.
So the reader doesn't know, really, essentially.
Yeah, so it's never spelled out for the reader. Like, he was in some branch of the military, and that he was in some sort of black ops group in the CIA, but that's really about it. I've never gone into detail about his family or his past or where he's from. And I try to keep his physical descriptions very minimal. Like, he has green eyes and brown hair, and that's about it. I don't really talk about him too much because that's just what I like as a reader. I like to be able to kind of fill in the blanks. And again, I think Fleming did that with Bond. You don't really know a lot about Bond. You see him and how he behaves, and you feel like you know him, but there's not like a huge backstory to the character. It's pretty much what you see is what you get, and you can kind of fill in some details yourself. And so that was what I would try to do. That was the goal for me.
I agree with you, and I think that's a really, really great point. I think that's why the Dear Bourne sort of premise is quite so powerful, because we don't know who the main character is, and that's a real draw, isn't it? Actually, for the reader, is to try and understand who this character actually is. And you're right. A lot of us aren't bothered about military terminology, and it doesn't mean anything that they were this post and went to this war and did this. It isn't really a concern. It's what are they going to do now that's really interesting, isn't it?
And also, I just feel like whether you're a Navy SEAL or, thriller heroes do incredibly improbable things, and if there's no Navy SEAL that's trained to, like, I don't know, look at all the things James Bond does in the movie, like hanging from a helicopter and, dropping down and grabbing a parachute off someone in midair. Like, it doesn't matter. Those are the things that are interesting, and there's really nothing realistically that trains you for that. So I just feel like the more detail you go into, the less plausible it becomes. Whereas if you just leave it mysterious, like, the audience could be like, wow, this guy really is skilled if he can do this, and it doesn't really matter how he can do it. So.
Exactly. And I think actually some of the movie makers of the 70s and 80s, and I know you're in the film business yourself, so I don't mean this offensively, and I'm sure you weren't working on these films, you're way too young for that, but but a lot of the Bond films, and I think this is replicated in other thriller film makes of that time, is that the character doesn't change. Nothing happens to that character. He wakes up, he goes to this place, saves the day, and leaves with a girl under his arm, ready for the next one. There's no sort of development. And in Fleming's novels, that is not the case. Each time...
I agree.
Each time Bond becomes a little bit more like reclusive or damaged or difficult, or
bitter,
we explore his bitterness, his sort of damaged attitude. And I wonder, maybe that's more of a sociological question, how TV audiences have changed now that we can sort of understand a character like that more, perhaps. I don't know. But certainly I think in your books you do that more, don't you? Explore that character in depth as opposed to just look at this.
I do. I think it's kind of weird. I think it's a fine line, like the character does change for sure over the course of my books, but I also didn't want it to be, in a series fiction, I didn't want him to be a completely unrecognizable person from one book to the other. Yes. So it's not like, like a lot of, I think that's the problem I have with a lot of those sort of story structures that they teach writers. Like, when everything is based on your main character making this big change, like, that's a fine story structure, but it kind of only works once, because then what do you do the next time? Like, if you're going to write about him again. And I think actually I love the Craig Bond films, but I think they sort of had that problem where the first 3 films, it's like sort of the same theme, like he's becoming James Bond. And then the next one, they kind of tried to do it again, and I'm like, well, didn't we see him become James Bond already? So I think you have to kind of find the little things, like what are the small aspects? So for Caine, he's definitely, like, if you read book 1 and book 4, he's still the same person. but he's slowly regaining a sense of trust. You know, like he starts out in the first book incredibly paranoid and bitter, and the betrayal is very fresh. And so by the fourth book, he's still a very cautious person who doesn't trust people, but he's coming back into the fold a little bit more. He's starting to realize that his paranoia and lack of trust can also be a detriment, you know, to his life. And so like I tried to take smaller things and build them while still keeping the basic character similar and recognizable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's because also you've got to appreciate that people do often read them out of order as well. And it wouldn't make sense, right? If you go on and write 20 of these and the book 20 is completely dissimilar to book 1, it would be wouldn't be a good way to be. It's a real hard one actually for thriller writers like you and I to sort of play that.
It's a puzzle, yeah. That's like that. It's a really fine line. I think you got to find those areas that you can work on that don't invalidate everything that came before, like you say. Yeah, like you never know where someone's going to jump in.
And I think, you're absolutely right. And I think the James Bond franchises can be like a cautionary tale to us here, because you've just mentioned the Daniel Craig ones, him reinventing himself, and then Casino Royale was a fantastic film. The following one, which name I can't remember, wasn't quite
Quantum
as good.
of Solace, yeah.
That was it. And then there was one more after that, I think. The name again that I forgot.
There's actually 2 more. So then there was Skyfall. Which I really liked Skyfall. It's a great movie, but story-wise, it is kind of still retelling that thing. Like, well, he's not quite James Bond yet, you know. And then there was Spectre, which Spectre didn't really work for me either, but for different reasons. But I think they're all good films. Don't get me wrong, but I think once you set up that kind of story, it's very hard. Like, what do you do after that? You know, it's like, well, you kind of shot your wad early, you know. So.
But we saw the same with the Pierce Brosnan films in terms of the technological advances, didn't we? Because in GoldenEye, he's got this giant satellite which can do something, and in the next one, he's got some laser space cannon that's chasing the car around a glacier.
The ice, yeah.
You know, and you sort of think there is no technological development that can better this in terms of threat. You know what I mean? Right. So then, obviously, in Casino Royale, they got rid of all technology, you know, and it just became, I've found that a problem, actually, talking of technology, and I wonder how you deal with it in terms of technology in a thriller is pretty boring, I find, because you could just be like, oh, there he is, he dropped a pin, you know. I've sent a virus to his computer. Now he's locked in his house. We'll just go and get. You know, like, how do you deal with that in your sort of kick-ass?
Like you say, I think any thrill, any genre, no matter what genre you're writing, you have to you have to be able to engender a suspension of disbelief. And I think modern thrillers do require. That's where you have to suspend disbelief, because in reality, the surveillance state we all live in is much more advanced than it typically is presented in thriller books. You know, I don't know. Have you ever read any of Barry Eisler's John Rain thrillers? Also mostly set in Asia. You'd probably like them. They're really good.
Oh, write them down. Barry Eisler.
Barry Eisler, John Rain. Yeah, and he sort of comments on it a few times where they're like, you know, I hope we weren't caught on a security camera, or, you know, we have to drive certain roads because they have fewer traffic cameras, you know, because it all takes is one camera and the whole world will know where we are. You know, he kind of hints at it, but the reality is, I think it's just something you kind of have to, you know, like in my books, I'll say, like, you know, Caine like keeps his head down and pulls his hat down. So, and that's, you know, that's it. That's all I'll say. And then, like, you just have to kind of go with it from that point.
Yeah. It's an interesting sort of a challenge for us.
It's kind of like, it's almost like if comic books, like my fiance and I were watching the Lois and Superman show last night, and all Superman stories hinge on the idea that no one can recognize Clark Kent. You know, like that the glasses are all he needs to hide. If you take that away, the entire series falls apart. Like, it would never make any sense. But so you just have to accept it. You know, and I kind of look at some elements of technology the same way for thrillers. You just have to. Well, do I want to read a story or not? Because in reality, sure, none of this would happen, you know.
But actually, I think that came down to one of the actors who played the early Superman, names eluded me, but he was fantastic because his whole mannerism changed when the glasses were on or off. That was it, yeah. And you just see him take the glasses off, and he just all of a sudden he'd stand up a bit straighter, and he'd hold them in a more masculine way, and then someone would walk in he wasn't expecting, and he'd suddenly go back to this sort of geeky, and it was absolutely fantastic, that transformation of character,
Totally. So they sell it. They sell it for the story, and it works. You're like, yeah, I believe it, But if you really think about it, his wife is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and she's met both of them, and she never puts it together that he's Superman. It's just, you just have to accept it for the story.
Yeah.
I think everyone gets one of those. You're allowed one of those per story, and then you have to make everything else make sense.
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? But I think before you do that, you've sort of got to earn the trust of the reader.
Yeah.
If that was page 1. This thing that was this unbelievable, someone would go, you're not having that. But if it was page 200, you'd probably be okay,
Yeah, it's a little easier to the audience is more invested at that point, right? So they want to keep going.
And I think people do have a perception that bonkers stuff does happen. Really?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like you turn on the news, there's all sorts of mad events, with someone trying to, There was a story about a terrorist attack that was thwarted by a guy with a narwhal tusk a little while ago that I read.
I haven't seen that. That's great.
If you wrote that, your readers would go, "No, you silly boy."
I don't know. I kind of like it now. Now I'm thinking, how can I work in a narwhal tusk? Maybe like a fight scene in an aquarium,
That's great, isn't it? That's it. Yeah. You've got some good fight scenes as well, speaking of those. Have you got any training in martial arts or anything like this?
I did. Well, for research, when I started writing the book, I did take 2 or 3 classes, like Krav Maga classes.
Oh, brilliant.
Just to kind of get a sense of it, but obviously 2 or 3 classes doesn't make me anything. If I was in a fight, I would get my butt kicked instantly.
Yeah.
No. But I did that, and then I bought a book I have several books about fighting, and so when I have a fight scene, I'll kind of look through the books and get some ideas for some moves and figure out the location where it's going to take place and what elements, like a narwhal tusk, could be there that you could use, and just try to put something in. I do come from that film background, so I try to look at those as scenes. Like, how would I stage this in a movie? What would be exciting, and then I put it together like that.
How has your film background then? Because I'm really interested in this. How has that changed you or developed you as a writer in terms of now coming onto your book?
Well, I think both kind of feed into each other. Like, what each influences the other. But I went to school as a film major, and I studied screenwriting, and I had completed several screenplays before I ever even tried to write a novel. Didn't sell any of them, but I'd written them. And so I think, like, if you read my reviews, there's a few comments that come up, and a lot of times the comment is it felt cinematic, or it felt like an action movie. And usually they mean that as a positive. Sometimes they mean that as a negative, like, oh, it just felt like a movie, not a book, But either way, that comment comes up a lot.
That's positive.
And I think, and I think that's because I kind of internalized that screenplay structure, that 3-act screenplay structure, which to me feels very natural. And so my novels are paced that way. So they're paced like a film, in my opinion. Whereas I think a lot of writers, if they don't have that background, the pacing's a little bit different, and it just feels different. Like Barry Eisler I mentioned, I love his books, but they don't feel like movies. They have a different kind of rhythm and tone.
Yes.
And so I think that it wasn't something I was consciously trying to do, but it clearly influenced me because I just hear that in my reviews over and over. So that must be the way I write it.
And I think that's a recipe for success as well, because I'm not sure the sort of Le Carre books or the Ludlum books would be as successful if they were released now, because of how long they are and how much dialogue there is in that early stage. You've talked about it already. There's a cabinet meeting between 12 people, all of which are introduced and described in minute detail about some other meeting that's going to occur in 3 days' time in another undisclosed location. And actually what you or I would do is we'd just have our person stalking up to the undisclosed location thinking about the intel that they'd read back in the helicopter, and breaking straight into the thing. We wouldn't show the whole thing because it's added 30 pages of unnecessary talking in there,
Well, like one thing I try to do with my action scenes, and I also think this comes from screenwriting, is that a lot of times when I read books, the action scene will be like a guy is chasing another guy up to a roof, and they get up to the roof and he shoots him and he falls off, and that's the end of the scene, which, that's fine. But like, if you did that in a movie, people would go like, oh, that's boring. Like, that's nothing, So when I always try to be like, well, how can I take that premise and then keep escalating it? So to me, it's got to be, he chases him up the stairs, but then the guy jumps over to the next building, and he jumps after him, but he misses and he crashes through a window. So now he's running underneath him and he has to catch up before he jumps to the next building, and then he grabs him and now they're falling, like trying to find ways to build it so that you have kind of a mini climax with each action scene, which that's cinematic writing. That's the way you would structure a screenplay. And so I just think, for better or for worse, and maybe some people don't like that, because like I said, I do think some of the comments compare the book to films in a negative light. Like, they want more of that kind of introspective inner narrative that only a book can give. But that's just my background. That's the way I think of writing. That's the way I approach a scene. And that's just the style I've adopted.
So is that something you avoid then, that introspection? Because it's something I've become very conscious about in my writing, is to keep to a minimum, or to not do too often in a chapter, maybe one passage or two passages in one chapter,
I think it just depends on the kind of book you're doing, and also the character. Like Caine, there are scenes of introspection, but they're usually not particularly long, because like I said, I'm trying to keep Caine mysterious, so I don't want the reader to know too many of his inner thoughts. In fact, when I was outlining the book, I was going to write it in first person perspective. And then I was like, oh, well, if I do that, the reader knows everything about what he's thinking, and I want to keep something secret. So I changed it to third person. So it just depends. I think some characters lend themselves more to introspection than others, So I am very conscious of what I think I'm conscious of is too much dialogue. Like, if someone's talking for 2 or 3 pages, then I'm like, I should cut that down. It's just not, I like dialogue and I like good dialogue, but I think that it works best in smaller, chunks.
Yes.
Because if you've got a conversation going on for pages, I feel like the reader's going to kind of lose what they started talking about, so I try to, that's why I look really closely, like, how can I whittle this down to just what has to be said,
Or it happens amid something else going on. So they were running away from something, or hiding from something, or watching something and having the conversation at the same time often makes it move a little bit quicker, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So we've talked already about you using some really inspirational settings in your novels. How do you make sure, and this is something I've struggled with many times, you balance describing the setting, so describing how the amazing streets of Japan and the neon and the crowds on the streets and the smell of those fantastic noodles or whatever. How do you sort of merge that with the action without having too much of one or too much of the other?
Yeah, that's a trick, right?
It's hard.
all I can say is I don't have like a set like method, but I know that it's a danger, and I'm always kind of, all right, where's the line? Am I hitting people over the head with it, or is it just enough that they have a sense of it? I just think you need to look at it when you're editing and just be like, how long am I really going on about the smell in the air? Like, or how many details have I given for this scene, and how many can the reader really, take in at once, and just, there's no real like kind of formula or method I can say. It's just kind of a sense of it,
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And you almost get that when you've stepped away from a manuscript, don't you? Or from a book that you're working on, and come back to it and read it through, and you're like, oh, I don't need all of this. You can cut some of those.
This is too much. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's absolutely vital. You can't, if you just have to look at it and figure out, am I going on for too long? Is this too much? But how do you know? I don't know. You just kind of, I think after you've done it a few times, you just kind of get a sense of what's too much. And for your first couple of books, make sure you're working with a good editor, right?
Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely true. How long does it take you to write one of your books then?
I've slowed down, unfortunately, over the years. The first ones, I could probably get them done in about Well, the very first one took me years,
Yeah, it always does.
After that, they took around 4 months each, I'd say about. But now I've slowed down, so it probably takes me about 6 months to write one now.
And that's from inception to being on the shelf, sort of thing.
Yeah,
that's
correct.
Not bad though, is it? Considering
I don't think it's bad. No.
Yeah. Do you have several projects on at once, so you're finishing one while starting the next one, or do you work in a block of time?
Not with books, but sometimes if I'm working on a screenplay, I'll like work on a book in the morning and then the screenplay in the afternoon, something like that, just to give my brain a break.
Yeah, just a different sort of model of work. I mean, as we said earlier, you must find that there's crossover with those two sort of things, and that they intrigue each other.
Absolutely. One of the best pieces of writing advice I ever got, very simple. So if there's any writers watching, this is the gold right here. Like anyone can adopt this and it'll make their writing better. It actually came from a book about writing novels, a book about prose writing, but I applied it to a screenplay I was working on, and I was like, wow, it's really helped. And that was when you're editing your manuscript or your screenplay, do a search for LY, because that will show you most of your adverbs, and then you can change them to like, so yeah, he walked slowly, then you can change it to he crept, or he crawled, or he stalked, and that's going to be a more visual image in the reader's head. So that was a book about novel writing, but the first time I used it was for screenwriting. So, and then we talked about how screenwriting structure influences my prose. So I think anything you do creatively, it's inevitable. It's going to like creep into other areas, of your life.
And we don't sort of realize often, I don't think, as writers, the effect that the books have, or the joy that our books bring to other people that sort of read them. And I think sometimes actually it's a surprise when we hear someone saying, oh, I really enjoyed this, this was amazing. And I was reading on your website a story about a guy who actually made one of your characters, or a model of one of your characters.
Oh yeah.
A fantastic story. Talk us through that.
So the book was Cold Kill, and there's a villain, and the villain in that book is a Russian Spetsnaz commander, and his nickname is the Iron Wolf because he has this like necklace with a wolf's head that he wears, and he and this team of mercenaries have been hired essentially to hunt Caine for this Russian mobster as revenge, and then they've dropped Caine in the middle of Siberia with no survival, gear, no weapons. He's just like dropped in the snow, and you have to, he's on the run for these hunters, and you have to find a way to find like shelter and warmth and all this stuff. And the leader, Spetsnaz guy, is a cannibal. Like he believes that when he hunts his prey, he wants to like eat their heart. He thinks it gives them his power. He's psychotic in that way. And so this reader in England actually really liked the book, and for whatever reason, this Iron Wolf character like really fascinated him. And so he started sending me these pictures he was an artist, and he worked in a physical medium like sculpture and stuff. And he started sending me this art piece that he said was inspired by the Iron Wolf. And the pictures were gorgeous. I was blown away. I was like, that's so cool. Like the idea that book inspired this guy to do that, really, I mean, that means a lot, as you know. And then when he was finished, he said, okay, like, what's your address? And I was like, well, why? And he's like, I'm going to send it to you. I was like, that's crazy. Like, you're in England. Like, the shipping is going to be exorbitant. And I don't want you to be out of pocket just for me. And he's like, no. And he's like, I made it for you. And so he sent me this sculpture
that is
of the Iron Wolf.
Incredible. It's so incredible. Yeah, I love it. And those things totally take you by surprise, don't they? You're here worrying about.
I could predict that. Yeah.
Yeah, worrying about, I haven't sold as many books as I hoped this month, or I'm really struggling to get the end of this done, or whatever. And it just takes it all out of context and shows you sort of the important, the importance of actually doing it, and what we sort of put together. On that basis, then, talking about inspiring books or books that have inspired people, would you pick out a couple of authors or specific books other than the ones we've mentioned that inspire you as a writer or as a creative, more than just sort of a thriller author? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. One of my favorite writers doesn't write thrillers at all. Is Haruki Murakami, the Japanese writer. His books, I can read them over and over and over. One of his earlier books, I think he wrote it in the late 80s. It's called Dance, Dance, Dance. And I've probably read that book a dozen times at least. I mean, almost once a year I read that book. Like it's, and they're very sort of interesting, kind of quirky, strange stories about Japan. Their characters, they're all set in Japan. They're usually very existential and have a kind of magical realism element to them. And this, they're very difficult to describe. Like they're very unusual books. But I mean, if you love Japan or if you have a love for that setting, like I highly recommend them, because like that's one of those books where you read it, you just feel like you've been to Japan and hung out with these really quirky, unusual characters. And actually, that influenced my writing a fair bit because of those books. One of the things when I'm researching an area is I always try to find something kind of odd or strange, about the area that I can work into the stories. And for Tokyo Black, that was that avatar that the girl uses when Caine sees her as a hologram. Like first he sees her. That's based on an actual Japanese character called Hatsune Miku, who is a virtual pop star. Like she puts on concerts and appears in media, but she's a hologram. She's not real, and that whole concept, like I literally Googled strange things about Japan. Like that was what I Googled. And she was the first thing that came up. I'd never heard of this phenomenon, and I was like, that's fascinating. Like she was created by a software company for this software that allows people to write songs. So if you're like a songwriter in Japan and you don't have a vocalist to work with, this software will sing the song that you write. And they created this character to go with it. And it just became this pop culture phenomenon on its own. And I was watching this concert in Japan with like a crowd of people like waving light sticks. And there's like a band of real people. And then right in the middle of them, there's this anime character come to life, like dancing on the stage. And I was like, that is fascinating. And so that element influenced that book a lot. That became a whole through line in the book. So that kind of looking out for the odd, quirky thing that you might never have thought of, but that tells you a lot about the location you're in. That to me comes from reading Murakami.
That's great, isn't it? And I think you're absolutely right. How you've taken sort of what is essentially a literary novel, you'd say, wouldn't you? Would you put that in the literary sort of character?
Literary fiction, absolutely.
And applying that to sort of a thriller or a more genre fiction book. And I think there's more crossovers than people would perhaps expect there to be, because you do use metaphor and all those sorts of skills that a literary person does, but it's got the action backbone that drags it through the various scenes, That's really interesting.
I think anything you find that speaks to you, whatever it is, there's always something there you can learn from,
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump over and have a quick look in the comments, and we'll see who's talking to us. Alison says, I think an author has to have passion in the books that you write to draw readers in. This was ages ago when we were talking about choosing, I think, the locations.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I agree.
Andrew says, cheers, guys. He's just signed up for your Andrew's newsletter. Yeah.
Hey, another Andrew.
One Andrew to another. Alison says, yeah, I've read Devil's Due. I do love Thomas as a character, and she needs to read a few more.
Thank you.
And Andrew again, I'm a little behind, but I love it when a book reads like a movie. Yeah, I think so. I think that's an important thing. Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, that's brilliant. That's really good. So the current book you say is Vietnam. Yeah. Are they all set in the present day, or are there sort of historical links to it?
They're all set in the present day, but a lot of times they have like brief flashes back, to things that happened in Caine's past that might either relate to the story or maybe relate to his state of mind that he's in. And this one in particular sort of wraps up, I'd say, the current. I mean, each book stands alone, but there's kind of a through line backstory, and this book kind of wraps up that backstory. So there's some callbacks to the other books as well, like little brief snippets and flashbacks and dream sequences and things where he's remembering some of the experiences he's had.
Would you ever write a historical book? Was that something that would interest
Sure.
you to do?
I mean, I don't know if I would write, like, I'm not a big historical thriller kind of guy, but I've always wanted to write a book about, I don't know if you'd consider historical or fantasy, but basically I have this premise for a Viking who's shipwrecked in feudal Japan and has to like team up with a Ronin samurai to like take down this warlord like in a village. So I don't know if that's quite historical, but that's something I would enjoy writing.
It's a long way to go in a longboat, isn't it, from Norway to Japan? Yeah. But I like it. But that's a whole genre, isn't it? What do they call it? Alternative history. That's the one.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. So how did that idea occur, and how do these ideas sort of appear in your mind?
Which idea?
The Viking in Japan.
Oh. Honestly, that idea literally just popped in my head. I'm sure like you as a writer too, you always get asked where do your ideas come from? Probably because I think that came to me because I love the old Conan the Barbarian movie, the John Milius movie from the 80s. I love Conan the Barbarian, big fan of that character. But I always felt like, well, okay, we're never going to get a Conan movie that good again, like they just don't make movies that way anymore. So to get that kind of feeling, you would have to create a new character. And I was like, well, what could that be? And I was like, well, I love Japan, obviously, and it just sort of popped into my head. But, another one, the science fiction series I write, Tales of Talon, that's basically Conan meets Star Wars. And that idea came about because I was talking to another writer. We were co-writing a thriller, and he also liked science fiction. And he was mentioning, oh, we should work on a science fiction story someday. And I said, oh yeah, or I'd also like to try some fantasy, because I've never written a fantasy novel. And he's like, oh, I don't really like fantasy. That's not my thing. And I was like, well, maybe we could mix them. I was just joking. I was like, we could do Conan the Barbarian meets Star Wars. And it was just a joke. But as soon as I said it, I was like, oh my God, I want to write that. I want to write Conan and Star Wars. And it just got stuck in my head from that joke. And that's where that whole idea originated.
So you write
3 books later.
We talked about you write sort of the sci-fi fantasy things on another pen name, just so as to not confuse.
Yes.
The readers.
Yeah, that's under A.A. Warren.
Does that have different challenges or different sort of skills that you need to bring over, or do you find that they're actually quite similar?
Well, I think the action and pacing is similar. I think that I still write it in my kind of style. However, when you're making everything up is sort of its own challenge. It's like, so with thrillers, the challenge is research, right? And communicating the essence of a place. With the science fiction, when everything comes from your head, that's its own kind of challenge. And sometimes you're like, I don't know, like what should this planet be like? I have no idea. We've seen everything. There's been so many of these kinds of stories. To come up with something, that fits what you need, but is a little different, it can be very challenging and time consuming. And sometimes I just have to stop and be like, all right, I just need to think about this for a day. Like, what would these aliens be like? Or what do I want them to be like? It can be anything, right? But what is interesting to me, or what do I think will be different, but exciting, and so that I think is the challenge there, when you've got really nothing to kind of fall back on. It all has to come from you.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that actually, because I read somewhere that people who sort of inventing a world from scratch, you need to know, do they have electricity? Where does the waste, where does the sewage go? How did they get there? You need to almost invent like how we got from our society in 2021 to this futuristic society in whatever year. You sort of need to know the timeline, don't you? So there's a lot of backstory.
Yeah.
It might not go in the book, but it needs to.
Right. You need to know it. Yeah. I mean, actually, it's funny you say that, because my books, they're not set like in our world. It's kind of like Star Wars. There's no Earth. But I did actually come up in my head. Like in my head, there is an Earth, and there's a connection between our world and this world, and I know it in my head, and I did kind of plan that all out, but it never appeared in any of the books, like you say. But I do think you do need to just build this sort of basis for yourself so that you're not lost, because it's so vast. Like you could create anything, and so you need a kind of starting point. So
It's probably the same as people that write about magic and things. There would be no challenge if you could just magic anything.
Do anything.
It would just
right.
be the end of the story, wouldn't it? So there needs to be some rules that you impose on yourself and the story.
yeah. My books have magic and technology, so I have to constrain both. Yeah, so it's tricky. It's like, what? Yeah, exactly. What are the limits? What can these people do? And then how do you challenge them? And what are the limits on their powers and things?
Do you alternate then? Write a Caine book and then write one of the sci-fi books, and then
yes and no. I think the first two sci-fi books I wrote back to back, and I wrote them very fast. Like each one only took about 2 months. Like I really was trying to kind of let myself go and just explode onto the page a little bit more. And because I was making it all up, I could do that. But then for the third one, I was kind of burnt out. So then I went back to Caine. Then I went back to the third one. Then I went back to Caine again, and now I'm writing the fourth Talon. So towards the end, I've kind of alternated, like you say.
It must be nice, as you talked about screenwriting and the refreshing nature of just moving on and doing another project in that sort of way.
It definitely helps. I don't know, I don't know how authors write one thing for 20 books. Like I would have a hard time doing that. I love it. I love reading it. Like it's great. But as a writer, definitely you come up on instances where you're like, oh, I think I've already written a scene like this. How do I make this different? Or how does he beat the guy this time? It starts to get difficult when you're writing a long series like that.
And as we've also talked about, the idea that the character needs to move on in some way. You'd run out of points, wouldn't you? Like,
what can I change? Yeah.
Have you got any plans to do any other series or any other ideas or any other genres that not in the near future, but at some point you think, I won't retire until I've written X, Y, or
Z. There's a character in the second book, the Red Phoenix book. It's actually the titular character. Red Phoenix is a code name for an assassin, and I don't want to. It's sort of a mystery who they are in the book, so I don't want to give away anything else. But that character, I would love to do a spin-off series with. And I've sort of been gathering ideas for that in the background. And then, like I said, I'd love to write some fantasy someday, something more directly Conan-esque. I love that genre as well. Maybe the Viking samurai thing, that'll have some fantasy elements. And I would love to do I love superheroes. I'm an old comic book fan. I grew up reading comic books. That actually has a lot to do with why I became a writer. So I would love to do something with superheroes, but I haven't really formulated any ideas yet.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's brilliant. We'll have one more look at the comments and then we'll wrap things up, Andrew, because I know you're early in the day. This Andrew, we saw that one already. He loves when a book reads like a movie. And Alison, a bit like the series Heroes, the writers have to have a great imagination to explore human talents. I assume she's talking about your
Heroes was great
series that we talk about. I'm not sure I remember it, but might have passed me by, as these things do. Andrew, it has been so nice to have this conversation with you. I absolutely love it. It's
awesome.
just the idea of talking books. Yeah, the idea of talking books, and particularly one set in fascinating and exciting places like yours.
Books and travel, you can't beat it. And
beer.
Absolutely. Books, travel, and beer. Yeah.
And beer. Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, stop around in a minute. We'll have a conversation when we've said goodbye. Awesome. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's been absolutely lovely to be able to talk to you. I'm back next week with a writer called Jake Needham, who also writes thrillers set in Asia. So quite similar to what we've been talking about. It seems that I've just been able to pick two people with quite similar sort of styles over the course of 2 weeks.
I'll check it out.
Yeah,
but
we're going a bit earlier next week, and I'll say this in my email because he lives in Bangkok, so we need to.
Oh, cool!
So for him, it's midnight, or 11 o'clock now, and he said I can't have a beer at 11 and be loud and laugh and enjoy it. So I said, okay, we'll do it 2 hours earlier, which would be rubbish for you because it would have been 5 a.m. So it would have made no help whatsoever.
I would be much less lucid at that hour.
Yeah. So if you'd like to tune in, thank you so much. And I'll see you next time for some more books and some more beer.
Take care.
All right.